Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bull Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex, as always, hosting this show. I wanted to use today's episode to talk about what we saw in the first two preseason games as it relates to predicting the 53-man roster, which will be made in about a week and a half, 2 weeks, when we kind of know the final Chargers team heading towards the end of August here into that September game against the Raiders. So, obviously there is still one preseason game left against Dallas. There are still spots in the air and spots that people will be competing for in that game. However, I do think we actually have a pretty good idea of at least 48 to 50 of these roster spots, barring some, special performances in this last preseason game. Never write it off, though, right? It was, Austin Ekeler back in 2017 who made the final roster spot with some of his final efforts in the second, or third and fourth preseason games during that time. So, things could change, but this is where I kind of feel the roster is right now. Doesn't mean I can't have a different thought tomorrow. They could also sign a free agent by the time this video is uploaded. But this is just kind of where we're at now and where I'm kind of leaning type of video. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Please don't click off the video because I've seen your comments about Easton Stick as well as Luis Perez. I actually spelled Luis Perez wrong. That's my bad. It is with an S and not a Z. But let's talk about it. I thought coming into this preseason, Easton Stick had an opportunity, particularly in that Seattle game, to essentially clinch the QB2 spot. And he's done everything but that. I think that he has put back-to-back weeks together of pretty bad performances. He was slightly better this week than he was in week one, if you look at least the statistical analysis of it. But I just thought mechanically he still looked very off from what we have come to expect of Easton Stick, where he didn't really trust his pocket presence, looked more confident when he was running the ball, I guess. But, 3 turnovers this preseason, 2 turnovers against the Rams where they were driving in Rams territory, one on the goal line and then another on the errant pass to Fehoko where he just kind of missed him. And if he plants his feet, they pick up a first down. So just unfortunate stuff for him all around. The discourse has changed kind of every week, but I really thought Easton Stick was pretty good last season when he was forced to play. And I think people forget that, he was forced to play in pretty bad circumstances too. I mean, no run game for the Chargers, bad offensive line, no Keenan Allen, no Mike Williams, sometimes no Josh Palmer even. So he was at a disadvantage, but really other than that Raiders game, the Chargers at least kind of kept games competitive offensively, and I think Stick kind of minimized some mistakes. But it's been a totally different story this year. He, had the chance to essentially clinch QB2, and he might still very well be QB2. I think he currently is. But he's left the door open for the Chargers, bringing in Luis Perez for competition. And then, perhaps after cut day, the Chargers looking for another QB2, whether that's somebody off the free agent market like Ryan Tannehill, whether that is trading with the team, whether that's, going out and picking up whoever's cut. The Browns have a bunch of quarterbacks like PJ Walker and Tyler Huntley, who may not make the roster. Tyler Huntley, pretty notable, given the Ravens connections. But all of that aside, I think the Stick performances, despite what Harbaugh has said in these, post-game press conferences, he named Stick the week 3 starter, said he improved. I don't fully buy that that's what the coaching staff thinks of Stick. I do think if the season started today, Stick is your QB2, but there is, still about a month, a little less than a month till week 1, and the Chargers can experiment and do a lot of things on the free agent market. Now, in regards to Perez, who I have listed here as just being off the roster, I thought he had a pretty interesting couple of throws against Seattle. He was honestly pretty bad this week against the Rams. Both he and Easton Stick, I really just think had a certain skittishness in the pocket in terms of decision making. So I don't think he's done anything to earn that QB2 job either. notable from I think one of Popper's reports last week was that Perez's first team reps went up basically as the QB3 on this team, or QB2 with Herbert hurt. So I'll be curious to see how the first team reps go up or down, if Stick gets all of the first team reps this week, or if Perez is in there, if they go sign another quarterback, obviously, and that's still a possibility here. But Harbaugh was asked by Popper, and this is the quote I put up here at the top, does Justin Herbert being injured impact how you think about the roster? And Harbaugh, or does it affect how you think about the backup quarterback position and the backup quarterback room in particular? And Harbaugh said, no, why would it? We have the same expectations on Herbert that we would have of the backups, whether Herbert was there or wasn't there. And that sort of got me thinking about keeping 3 quarterbacks, because I think the assumption that a lot of fans had once Herbert got injured was, oh, well, now they're going to keep 3 quarterbacks. And I just think with the way the emergency quarterback rule works, with the underwhelming play from all of the Chargers quarterbacks this preseason, I just don't see them keeping 3, especially I don't see someone being like, man, we got to get Luis Perez, we got to get Max Duggan on our practice squad, right? I don't see there being a ton of competition to claim them for another 53-man roster. So I still think you can have the interactions in the quarterback room that you want to have without keeping that spot. And even Tom Telesco realized that last year when he ultimately only kept 2 quarterbacks and decided to waive Max Duggan. So, I think the Chargers keep 2 quarterbacks. I have Easton Stick in there as QB2 because that's what he is right now. But I sort of mean that as just a placeholder for the time being. We'll see what happens as the weeks go on here. If the Chargers decide to bring in more quarterbacks, if the Chargers, feel comfortable after preseason week 3, but Harbaugh announced Stick was starting week 3, despite, what myself and, some of the rest of the fan base thinks about his performances. So it is still currently his job to lose, even though he's done everything to lose the job. So I have them keeping 2. We'll see whether that ends up being Easton Stick or not. Let's talk about the running backs. I have 4: Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, Jarrett Patterson, and Kimani Vidal, and then Spiller and Dotson off of the roster. I listed guys here as being off in terms of guys who could compete for the practice squad. Dotson obviously is a guy who, has been on the main roster in the practice squad. Last year, Spiller has been on the main roster, so I wouldn't be surprised if they want to keep one of those guys around. The biggest question on this list, going into last week in Popper's article where he, cut Kimani Vidal in his 53-man roster prediction was, what's Kimani going to look like when he's healthy? He was really fucking good. And I'm not just saying that because, I loved him coming out of the draft, obviously, but I just felt like watching his college tape, as soon as he got a chance to play when he was healthy, his vision, his balance, the way he cuts is just so unique and something that this team doesn't necessarily have as a skill set. Gus is more your kind of physical runner. JK sort of had that skill set, a couple of years back, but obviously has been through, the injuries, unfortunately, the last few years. Patterson, I think, has, proved himself to be sort of your RB3 or RB4. I think he will be on the roster, whether that's flipped up or down on the depth chart with Vidal, we'll see. But he was really impressive against the Rams. 11 rushes, 49 yards, 4 first downs, 2 catches. I just felt there was a certain calmness and certain, decision-making chops that he had at the line that Spiller and Dotson just don't have, right? And they've all been playing behind the same poor offensive line, right? And they all played, actually the offensive line itself had a better day, I think, in the run game on Saturday. But, the numbers are what they are. Spiller's averaged something like 1.7 yards per attempt rushing this preseason. And, Vidal is averaging 4.5 yards per carry after that performance. So I also just think, this was this regime's first running back draft pick. Greg Roman had to be sold on him. And, ultimately, Joe Ortiz talked him up a lot, in terms of what he does, both as a runner and not as a runner, in terms of his blocking presence on the Luis Perez completion to QJ. Kimani Vidal actually had, in my opinion, a really good block that gave Perez a couple extra seconds, essentially, to get that ball off to Quentin Johnston. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to blame anyone or take my revenge on people who cut Kimani Vidal off of the roster, but it's clearly his spot to lose at this point. And I think with the way Harbaugh talked about him after the game, just with the way fans kind of watched a decisive running back, really make those cuts in the preseason. I think it's he's got the roster spot. And we'll see what happens with Spiller and Dotson kind of on the practice squad. But again, I would really like to keep one of Isaiah Spiller or Elijah Dotson in the practice squad, perhaps both, because, how much can you rely on Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins from a health standpoint? But, that is what it is. So I've got 4 running backs. My guy, Kimani Vidal, is making the roster after an electric performance. And then we have the other 3 here, Gus, JK, and Jared Patterson, who has gotten a lot of the RB3 reps to this point. But how much that changes during the season, we'll see in terms of the usage of Vidal, which I know as fantasy people on Twitter, keep asking me about the running back room. I've gotten a ton of messages and ads about fantasy. I don't care about fantasy at all. Anyway, let's talk about wide receivers. I originally, in my Bolt Beat article I wrote in July, had the Chargers keeping 7, which was essentially this same group plus Cornelius Johnson. After seeing training camp and after seeing Cornelius Johnson really not be involved much in the offense in the first preseason game and being kind of actively bad on offense in preseason game number 2, I have him off the roster. He hasn't contributed quite enough on special teams. He's gotten a few reps here and there, but there's other wide receivers on special teams that they clearly trust more, including Jalen Gill, who has had a presence in the return game without Darius Davis. So I think it's Gill or Fehoko who would ultimately get that roster spot before Cornelius Johnson. And I go with 6 here. It could change due to injury, but Palmer, McConkey, and DJ Chark, I think, is pretty clearly your top 3, sort of in any package, at least to start the season. And then we'll see how Quentin Johnston and Brendan Rice's usage will change. If it was a complete meritocracy, right, I think Fehoko would be on this roster with what he's shown this preseason. He was the highest graded offensive Charger against the Rams, and then had a really, really good week against the Seahawks as well. So unfortunately, I just think this is one of those spots where unless you keep 7, which means taking away running back, taking away a tight end, or taking away somebody from the defense, I just don't think there's a spot here for one of them. But yeah, this is kind of what we expected the group to look like heading into the season. This is what it looks like right now. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a slight change in either direction, whether that's keeping 7 or swapping a name here or there. But I thought it was very notable in terms of Brendan Rice, who hasn't produced a lot necessarily in this preseason or training camp, but the coaching staff had Brendan Rice starting essentially that preseason game, and he's been on the field before Quentin Johnston in back-to-back weeks. So take that for what you will. That doesn't necessarily mean, hey, this guy's first team in the preseason, this guy's second. But I did think it was pretty noteworthy in terms of how safe is Brendan Rice's roster spot. Because people ask us stuff like that all the time. It's pretty safe. He is making the team. And I think it's this group of 6, including Darius Davis, with his impact on special teams, that will make the Chargers roster. Tight ends and fullbacks. This is where it gets interesting. This is probably the position that I'm least confident in from an offensive perspective. But Hayden Hurst Will Dissly. I mean, those are your two locks. Donald Parham, I think, makes it. They've talked up Parham, before in terms of, his ability in the red zone. Obviously, has had a pair of nice preseason games, essentially, after, being injured for a portion of training camp. And that will, to some extent, always be the conversation with him. But I still think this coaching staff, for how cheap Parham is still going to try to use him and see what he can do. We'll see if maybe there's a decision here. If you want that receiving tight end between Parham and Stone Smart, I kind of think that is the calculus. As of now, I think they lean Parham, but we'll see if that changes, over the next game or any period going forward. And I have Tucker Fisk. Now, a lot of people may not know who Tucker Fisk is. He was just signed last week, but he actually played a lot of essentially tight end fullback, a la, sort of what Ben Mason was supposed to be for this team. And he leaped into that role pretty nicely on Saturday, had a couple key blocks that sprung Vidal and others for some pretty good runs. So he was good in run support from what I could see. He was also pretty decent in pass protection. I think even though Zion will probably be the full-time fullback one, I think they're going to want to have a guy that is sort of a Dissly backup, if you will, right? A guy who can set into that blocking role nicely. Obviously not as good as Dissly, who's one of the best blockers in the league. But I think they want somebody in that mold just in case, right, Zion has to play with the first – or sorry, not Zion. Just in case – sorry, I meant Jordan McFadden. I don't know if I said Zion before, but McFadden. Just in case Jordan McFadden, right, somebody gets injured, he has to go in at center. He has to go in at guard. I think they want a guy that will be there in the fullback room, in that tight end room, that can contribute in that fullback type of way. And so I think that Fisk kind of becomes a Jordan McFadden insurance policy in case he does at some point this season have to start on the offensive line. And I think his blocking in any respect in special teams or on offense is a pretty decent asset to this team. I think that last spot versus, Stone Smart and Luke Benson is kind of, as well as Zach Hines, who's still on the roster, is kind of the fight going into the final preseason game. But after watching him against the Rams, I give the slight edge to recently signed Tucker Fisk. So we'll see that going forward. Offensive line, pretty cut and dry at this point. I really don't know if there's a debate to be had. Rashawn Slater starts at left tackle. Zion Johnson starts at left guard. Bradley Bozeman starts at center. Pipkins at right guard. Joe Alt at right tackle. And then I have the depth pieces being Foster Sarell, Brendan Jaimes, Jamari Sallier, and Jordan McFadden. Now, I think there was a battle essentially between Foster Sarell and Alex Leatherwood. For all intents and purposes on my end, I don't think that's much of a battle anymore. I think Foster Sarell has actually played pretty nicely in this preseason, and Alex Leatherwood has been outright terrible to watch. I don't know what else to say. Like, technically PFF graded him pretty well, but anytime you watch him, he just, I think positioning wise, he does okay for himself, but he's just so slow to react right from the jump of the play. And that has created a bunch of pressures from the Chargers this preseason, 6 in the first preseason game. And, they have not tried Leatherwood at guard at all. And I think that tells you a little bit of what they think about Leatherwood at guard to some extent. But, he did a little bit of that, I think, in Chicago while he was on Chicago's practice squad. So I don't know. I think the fact that they have been more willing, Foster Sarell has put up better performances at tackle than Leatherwood, and they've been more flexible in where Sarell plays in the line as opposed to Leatherwood. And going into that first preseason game, I think it was, Greg Roman who said that battle essentially was kind of a dead heat between the two of them. But I really don't think it's a dead heat anymore. I think for all intents and purposes, Sarell has clearly defeated Leatherwood. And then the rest of it is pretty self-explanatory. Jaimez is your backup center. I don't think he's been the best this preseason, but that's what it is. Jamari Sallier, kind of your swing guard, can also play tackle as well. And then McFadden, who is probably going to be this team's fullback after training camp and after the way the preseason has played out. We haven't seen too much fullback Jordan McFadden in these preseason games, but I think they're still working him pretty clearly into that role. So these are the 9 along the offensive line. Edge. This is an interesting one. Obviously, the 4 that will make the roster, are guaranteed to make the roster, are pretty well known. You have Joey Bosa, you have Khalil Mack, Tuli, as well as Bud Dupree, who they signed in the offseason to a 2-year contract. What we've seen from Tuli and Bud, I think this preseason has actually been pretty interesting, particularly that first preseason game where I think you see some of what Jesse Minter wants to do with Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack and all these guys when they are playing in the regular season together. And I remember one play particularly, I think, on that first drive of the Seattle game where you had Bud Dupree and Tremont Morris-Brash on the edge, and then they kick Tuli inside, and that results in a couple pressures, but also a deflected pass by Morris-Brash on that play. And I think that is sort of the type of intensity, the type of moving around with these chess pieces that Minter wants to do in the regular season. As far as keeping a 5th edge, because I know this has been mentioned by Tyler, I know this has been mentioned by others, and I think from a special team standpoint, it's not the worst idea in the world, certainly, to keep a 5th edge. If it was to be anybody, I really do think it would be Rumph, who's contributed on FIC and special teams. But the complication, of course, with that right now is that Rumph is injured. And so he was in a walking boot, I think, during Saturday's game. And from reports from Chris Rim, from the team, is that he's going to be out for quite some time. That is, what the quote was. I do not think they intend on this being a week-to-week injury. It sounds like he's going to be out a while. So does that result in him getting placed on IR? Does that result in him getting waived with some type of injury settlement? I don't know. But he's not in a position right now with his health, essentially, to be the team's 5th edge that they would keep for special teams. So I have therefore gone with 4. Tremont Morris-Brash, again, a guy that I think could be a practice squad contender in this capacity, especially if Rumph is injured, with how much Minter's liked his performances. But I think he just misses the cut here in regards to the edge room. Interior defensive line, I have the Chargers keeping 6. Morgan Fox, Otito Ogbonya, Poona Ford, kind of essentially in some order like your starters. Scott Matlock figures into that as well, with how much he's played in both training camp and the preseason. And then they signed Taylor Tart, who was cut by Miami this week, previously in Seattle. And so he honestly looked really good in this limited action that he had on Saturday. I think he was one of the highest graded defensive Chargers as well by PFF, just pretty consistently affecting plays, getting pressures, and having a lot of presence about him in that interior defensive line. I thought his performance was really solid in the snaps that he did play. Again, limited, sort of in the vein of Luis Perez because he just joined the team a couple days ago. But he showed what he has left in the tank. Boydby, the team's 4th-round draft pick, did not play in the preseason game. I think he's working through some type of injury, but I mean, I don't see them cutting the 4th-round pick that they just got. I wish we had a little bit of a better sense of where he stood in terms of the roster entering training camp and entering the preseason than we do now. But again, I think he makes the roster, or if there is some injury, he gets placed on IR and they bring someone else up, but certainly would not be cut or anything in this scenario. So I do think these are your 6. I feel a certain way about the interior defensive line because I really want it to be good. And I think there are some, guys that can be good performers on the line. But this is a really concerning area of the team. I think just not having a whole lot of pass rush presence consistently in this group Morgan Fox, obviously not necessarily your prototypical every down player. And so I am a little bit concerned with what this interior defensive line looks like right now, essentially kind of relying on breakout seasons for Ford and Matlock. Credit to Otito Ogbonya, who I think has played really well in the preseason, and it's a good story for him. Who I mentioned up here. He essentially talked about this being his first off season. He's been fully healthy, coming into the league after the injury his first year. So I think you can really see him, ratcheting up the pressure and the intensity on that interior defensive line whenever he's played this preseason. So that's been a positive sign, I think, to see from the interior defensive line room. Linebackers. I have the team keeping 5, and this is the one spot I wish the team could kind of keep more, as I show in my, off the roster. Ooh, sorry, jumped ahead. As I mentioned in my off the roster portion here, I do not have Shane Lee or Shaq Quarterman making the roster. They also just signed Frank Ginda, formerly from Michigan, formerly from the UFL. He played, I think, with the Michigan Panthers. So, I think that that's an interesting piece to all this, in terms of going after this linebacker depth. That makes me think a little bit about Neiman. Is he, a little injured and they want to, shore up the linebacker depth? I don't know. That is kind of the interesting part in all this in terms of signing all of these linebackers that they have. But assuming everyone's healthy, I do think this is the 5. Sorry, I just meant Ginda played with the Michigan Panthers, not the Michigan football team. He played at San Jose State. But yeah, so I think this is your pretty clear 1 through 5 group. Perriman and Henley have looked really great this preseason. And I think the linebackers have a certain intensity and poise to them that has not existed in there in previous seasons for this team or in previous off seasons. DeVaro Bowman, credit to him, I think has really coached these guys really well. When you look at the product on the field, they fit really nicely into Jesse Minter's scheme, which I think has benefited them. But Perriman's looked great. Henley's looked great. Colson, obviously, we're waiting to kind of see as he recovers from his appendicitis and appendectomy. But, I think eventually he'll kind of crack that rotation as well. Obviously, they drafted him for a reason. But I did not expect to come into August being really confident in the linebackers, a couple months ago. And I'm really confident in the linebackers. This group has played really well in the preseason. I think the development that you see with Henley in terms of how he's able to read and react to plays and always be in the right position at the right time is just something, we didn't see last year, as he was obviously playing more of a special teams role. But he's come along very nicely in pass coverage. I'm really excited to see this top 3 group play out. And then I think Nick Neiman and Troy Dye right now are your special teamers. So Shane Lee is a guy who I think has been disruptive in this preseason, and I hope there is a spot for him on the practice squad or even this 53-man roster if the coaching staff thinks he can crack it. But I think he is, at this point, more of a practice squad proposition, if you will. 10 DBs. So I just combined all of the corners and safeties into, one slide here. But your corners, I don't think there's any surprises. Starting trio is Christian Fulton, Asante Samuel Jr., and Ja Taylor. I think we've seen positive things from Fulton in this training camp and preseason. How much I buy that translating into the regular season remains to be seen, right? And obviously we kind of have to worry about injuries, with him. But, hopefully he does have the breakout season that the Chargers coaching staff and defense believes he can have. ASJ starts on the outside as well. Confident in him. He's talked about this being a contract year, so we'll see how he plays. Ja Taylor's in the slot. And then I have 3 other corners on the roster, essentially, in Dean Leonard, Tarheeb Still, and Cam Hart, 2 of them being draft picks. I thought Still actually had a really nice game versus the Rams. Dean Leonard also had a really nice game versus the Rams. I'm a little surprised we haven't seen more Cam Hart, but don't think that's necessarily a problem at this stage. Safeties, Derwin James, Alohi Gilman, and then things get interesting, right? I think AJ Finley, for all intents and purposes, has locked down safety 3, as the guy there. I am a little surprised we have not heard more about Tony Jefferson, like just kind of being involved really in any way here. He's been pretty consistently on the third team, didn't practice all of this week. I don't think he played on Saturday, if I'm correct, or at least I don't remember seeing him on the field. And then, JT Woods is an interesting thing here too, because he has been playing outside corner and trying, the coaching staff is trying to see what they have at him as potentially corner in the second half of both preseason games. So I don't know what to make of that in terms of his safety on the roster at safety, because it just seems that they don't really trust playing him there, and they want to experiment to see if there is a use for his athleticism elsewhere on the roster. So I don't know. I don't see JT Woods kind of making it if that's what they're already doing. And Thomas Harper, has had a really great training camp and preseason, played really well against the Rams, has played pretty well on special teams, and has played great in both preseason games, just kind of constantly being disruptive again, knowing where to be in this Minter read and react scheme. As of now, I don't know if this is how it will play out, but I give Harper a lot of credit in terms of how he's come along and made his presence felt on the roster, as opposed to JT Woods and Jefferson and some of these other guys who are, competing for that safety role. Could they get the spot? Perhaps. I wouldn't be shocked if it ends up being JT Woods at the end of the day. But I think Tony Jefferson is kind of out of the race at this point, and I think Harper has just come on stronger at safety, more so than JT Woods has, in my opinion. And then to wrap it up, no surprises here. These are your three specialists. Cam Dicker, who has had an amazing preseason. He's been the only source of Chargers points, in this preseason, with a 58-yard field goal, and he's been long bombing them all over the place. You had that special teams tackle in week 1, which was really fun to watch. So Dicker, the kicker, is obviously on the roster. Josh Harris at long snapper, and then J.K. Scott as the team's punter. But that is just my 53-man roster prediction. Let me know if there's any surprises, upsets you guys think will make the roster, whether that's a surprise cut or a surprise make on the team as the Chargers get closer to the eventual final preseason game and then cut down day. But that'll do it for me. I hope you guys have a fun week watching this final preseason game. Real football is almost here. It'll be time for Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack to give Gardner Minshew hell before you know it. And without any further ado, my name is Alex, and as always, bolt up.